Got a lot to go over on today's lesson. We're in week 6 of the parables of Jesus. This week's called Accumulating My Treasure. And it's the parable of the rich fool is what we're going to be looking at today. And it's in Luke chapter 12, specifically verses 13 to 21. And then we'll actually move on to go all the way to verse 34 is what we're going to look at. You know, we hear this word used a lot in our world today. You're a fool. Don't be a fool. Pay attention. Listen to what I'm talking about. You're a fool. To be a fool in God's eyes is to have missed the point of life. I think in our society, the word fool is thrown around like it's nothing, you know. But really, when we look at it from a biblical standpoint, it means to have missed the point of life. The remarkable thing is that the person of God, the person that God calls a fool, oftentimes the world would call them a success, that the world would call them a person to be envied, right? Think back with me, put your time travel thought process on. We're going to go back to the 1980s when the yuppies were really kind of in there, right, in their swing. Actually, 1980s was called the decade of the yuppies. And much as an earlier era chanted, you know, in the 60s, we chanted, "You can have it all." But in the 80s, the yuppie slogan became, "You should have it all." It went from "you can" to "you should," right? Okay? A study of contemporary American youth by the Cooperative Research Program in 1988 concluded this, that this generation is overwhelmingly materialistic, interested more than ever primarily in making money. Now, that generation brought forth a breed of preachers which baptized this impulse of making money. They called it the health, wealth, and prosperity theology, the health and wealth gospel that we hear, right? Epitomized by one preacher who said, and I quote from the pulpit, "If the mafia can ride around in Lincoln Continental town cars, why can't the king's kids?" On the surface, it makes sense, right? Now, baby boomers and yuppies didn't invent the pursuit of possessions, although they have refined the art, okay? Our time will probably not be characterized by any radical turning from materialism. It's obviously gotten worse as time has progressed. We have been nurtured in a society that seduces us with the promise of affluence and measuring worth on the basis of possessions and positions, right? We've all heard that phrase, keeping up with the Joneses. Joneses got a new car, we need to get a new car. Joneses got their house painted, we need to get our house painted, right? Okay? The Lord once told a group of Pharisees described as the people who loved money that what is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. And in the parable of the rich fool, which we find in Luke chapter 12, verses 13 to 21, he forces all of us to face some searching questions about ourselves. And that's what we're going to dive into today. So let's start with this scripture, Luke chapter 12, verses 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Now, I'm no gospel scholar that does translations, but when I read this, I'm like, that is so out of place. I can't hear Jesus saying that. I can hear somebody in our generation go, "Man, who appointed me a judge?" You know, but I just can't hear it. But anyway. But Jesus continued. Then he said to them, "Watch out and be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. And he thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself but is not rich toward God." So if we go back put on our Palestinian Jewish thinking process and realize what was going on in the time of Jesus, He's moving towards Jerusalem. This is a little later in his ministry, okay? He's moving towards Jerusalem. He knows that's the destination he needs to go to. Luke tells us that there was a crowd of many thousands that had gathered, and so much so that they were trampling on one another. That's in Luke chapter 12, verse 1. Okay, that's the scene that sets this whole thing of what's going on. At the same time, his enemies had begun to oppose him fiercely and to besiege him with questions, trying to catch him something that he might say that they can use against him, right? Then there was also that group, what I always call the dark group in the background, that were plotting. We don't need to catch him in something. We just got to figure out how to get him killed, okay? In that context of popular acclaim and deep hostility both happening at the same time, the Lord calls his disciples to be bold and fearless witnesses on his behalf. That's in Luke chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Okay? He continues speaking, but then suddenly there's this guy in the crowd who he couldn't care less about what Jesus was talking about, right? He had a family problem related to an inheritance. Now, apparently, he was the younger of two brothers. And according to Jewish law, his older brother would not only have been the executor of the estate, but he would have been the largest recipient of the inheritance. Okay? If any of us have ever had to deal with large families, you know that as things get broke up, that inheritance becomes smaller and smaller. But typically what you see, especially around here, out here in this area in the Midwest, what you see is the kids going, I don't want to leave the farm intact. Just sell it off and give me my part. Right? You see that a lot out, especially out, you don't see that down in like St. Charles County and city. You see it a lot out here. You know, the farm that we used to live on, Kendall, that, you know, when you were the youth minister at Wentzville, there was 90 acres there. That has now been sold off so the kids could split it up. That's now where the David Hochul Parkway comes across. That was the back end of the property that we raised the kids on, the 90 acres. So that's pretty normal, okay? However, the older brother would have tried to maintain it. He would have wanted to keep it intact because it's worth more together than it is all split up. But that wasn't the younger brother's plan. He wanted money of his own to use as he pleased. Now, it was common back in the Jewish days, in the days of Jesus, it was very common to bring a disputed point of law to an accredited rabbi. You didn't go to a lawyer, you went to a rabbi to talk about a disputed point in the law, especially Jewish law, okay? And so that's why he just blurts it out. Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Now, his words tell us a lot about him. First of all, he doesn't ask the Lord to make a judgment. He doesn't say, Lord, I got this problem, and I want you to listen to it and tell me your decision on this. How should this be handled? But he wants him to side with him so he can provide ammunition against his brother, right? Hey, Lord, tell my brother to divide the inheritance up, right? Like many since him, he wants to use Jesus to meet his monetary desires, okay? The Lord refuses to be drawn into such a role by answering, man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you? Jesus has no legal standing as an accredited rabbi to be involved in such cases. But more importantly, Jesus realizes that this task has no part of his mission. It has nothing to do with his divine mission, right? And that's an important truth that we need to embrace when some people tend to want to teach us that believers can and should expect the Lord to provide physical well-being and prosperity. Okay? Goes back to the guy on the roof during the flood. The Lord's going to provide. Guy comes by in a rowboat. No, I don't. The Lord's going to provide. Guy comes by in a big speedboat. Nope, Lord's going to provide. Guy comes by in a helicopter. Nope, Lord's going to provide. Finally, the water's slapping at his legs. Lord, Lord, why didn't you provide? Dude, I've sent you 2 boats and a helicopter. Right? I mean, that's pretty typical of sometimes what is shared, okay? Even if this man is being wronged by his brother, getting his rights may not be the best for him. There's a deeper issue involved and a greater danger than being cheated out of your inheritance. And this is that danger. It's the danger that the Lord has in mind as he turns from the guy who asked the question and he turns to all the people, to them, and says, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Now, the initial words, watch out, be on your guard. That should put the Lord's next phrase in neon lights. What Jesus has in view is not just a sin, but a serious yet subtle sin. Now, some sins are clear and recognizable, and a lot of times Christians are quick to label them as evil and condemn participation in them. We've talked a lot about that in our studies here, how we tend to categorize them, right? Rarely do we think of greed as a horrific sin. But I want you to think about this. Never once did Jesus tell a parable to warn about adultery. Never once did Jesus tell a parable to warn about drunkenness in such dramatic terms as he uses here in talking about covetousness. Okay? I read that and I was like, oh, never really thought about that. He spoke about them, but not in this kind of a dramatic fashion. See, the poorest person can be greedy, and the richest person can avoid greed. But the danger of possessions is that they often arouse the desire for more. Okay? Greed is no laughing matter. It is, in fact, considered adultery. Colossians 3:5 says, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Right? The Lord leaves no doubt that, and this is his words, a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Right? God alone is the source of life. God controls life. God alone gives life. So, Jesus is not content just to give an abstract warning if through this parable of the rich fool. In the parable of the rich fool, he introduces us to literally the first century Jewish yuppie. Okay? Wealth often begets wealth, and his wealth enabled him to possess land that produced a bumper crop. Okay? And Jesus doesn't criticize the fact that he has wealth. He doesn't criticize how he acquired it, and he doesn't criticize the increase of the wealth. What he does criticize and what is decisive is what he chooses to do with it. Even then, it's not so much his actions as it is his assumptions that are crucial. Think about this. Given his values, which is building bigger barns, that's a wise and a pragmatic choice. If you have a bumper crop, you've got to do something with it, right? Yet this is precisely the question. What are his values? So there's three things that we can see in this passage that defines this man. The first thing is selfishness. I. 6 times he says that. I. He's totally preoccupied with himself. For him, the purpose of having is self-indulgence. I deserve it. I owe it to myself. I'll do it my way. Right? All the anthems and the slogans of the 21st century selfists, they were known to our first century cousins. Right? Okay? So the first thing is selfishness. The second thing is materialism. The purpose of having barns is to get bigger barns. And the good life comes from having good things. So, therefore, the quality of the future that he anticipates is directly related to the size of the barns he builds. He could no more be content with medium-sized barns than Imelda Marcos could have been content with 10 pairs of shoes. I see some of the wheels turning. Imelda Marcos, wait a minute, yep. Got thrown out of power and had, what was it, like 10,000 pairs of shoes or something ridiculous like that, right? In fact, his third problem is characterized by hedonism. And that is because he says, I'll say to myself, take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Now, we don't want to miss the Lord's point. Solomon in Ecclesiastes 3:13 tells us that it is a gift of God, quote, that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. So if Solomon says that's a gift of God that we do that, this guy was kind of doing that, or was he? Because see, Paul also spoke on this. He tells us that God provides us with everything for enjoyment in 1 Timothy 6:17. It's right to enjoy what we have, but it is wrong to believe that self-indulgent pleasure is the goal of life, as this guy does. He believes that his wealth makes him master of his present and his future. So in other words, it's okay to have things, but you don't let those things rule you. That's not the point of what you're doing, okay? We can summarize this guy's view of life in several phrases that ring out through the years. If I'm not good to myself, who will be?
Yeah, have you considered what he said? He didn't say, I'll add barns to the ones I have. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones.
Yes. Yeah. It's not that what I have is enough and I can store some somewhere else. It's I need bigger. I need better. That's exactly what it is. How about this phrase that we hear? The bigger the barn, the better the life. When all of us are farmers. The bigger the car, the better the life. The bigger the house, the better the life. If money can't buy happiness, well, it can at least buy pleasure and security. Right? Those are all phrases that we hear. But here's the thing. In just a moment, in one moment, the bubble can burst. God passes sentence on this rich fool, but on every life based upon covetousness. He says, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you've prepared for yourself? And what the Lord says here is unrelenting in its honesty and it's revealing in its insight. And here's these three things that stand out in these words that he says. First of all, he is a fool. He's not a success. Okay? Certainly in the community's eyes, he was a man to be envied. But in God's eyes, he was a fool to be pitied. The term fool in biblical language, it's not a description of mental ability, but a description of spiritual discernment. In the Old Testament language of the Psalms and the Proverbs, a fool was considered an individual who makes a choice as if God doesn't exist and who lives as if God hasn't spoken.
Do you realize every time you say I, you're leaving Jesus out?
Oh, sure you are. There's no I in Jesus. There's no I in God at all. At all. It's a hard thing, especially in our society today. And obviously we're really not that different from first century Jewish people because they had that problem as well. 11 times in this passage we either hear the word I or my. 11 times, right? For all intents and purposes, God doesn't exist. Nowhere in there does he say, I will pray about this and see what God wants me to do. Maybe God wants me to give part of what won't fit in the barn away. Right? So he's a fool. He's not wise. He is a servant. He's not a master. The rich man is convinced that he's in control of his life and that wealth gives him control. But God's words to him make it clear he has no power. This very night, your life will be demanded from you. Now, the word demanded is a commercial term, and it's a commercial term that is used of a loan. Okay? The phrase we would use now is I'm calling in your note. Right? That would have been in Jewish time, that was calling in the note. It was demanded of him. I'm calling in your life note. That's what God said, basically. At this crisis point, he discovers a truth that everybody is going to learn sooner or later. God owns his life, and he merely loans his earthly existence here. Right? It's just a loan. At any time, God can call in his loan. The fool has no power over the future because God then says, who will get what you have prepared for yourself? As the writer of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, says in Ecclesiastes 2, verses 18 through 19, he says, I must leave my wealth to the one who comes after me, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. Right? So he's a servant, he's not a master. He is a pauper, he's not a rich man. In the moment of truth, the wealthy farmer realizes that he has worked so hard for so little. He's invested in what's going to pass away, not in what is permanent. What makes death hard is the evaluation of what we lose by it. Why is it that when we think and talk and look at death, we struggle with that? Now, I know some people don't. I'll be honest, I struggle with death just because it's unknown. Now, I'm not afraid of it, but I'm like, oh man, I'm not going to get to see my wife again. I'm not going to get to see my grandkids.
You don't have that to look forward to.
Yes, let me rephrase that. Physical death. Right. The separation of my spirit from the body. I'm like, what is that going to be, how does that work? Obviously, it's been working for thousands of years, so it's, but literally, we evaluate that by what we're going to lose, okay? Now, this is a man who's leaving everything behind. The barns he's built, the people he's controlled, the prestige he's acquired. Death strips him bare and reveals him for who he is a man who stores up things for himself, but he's not rich towards God, right? Okay? And then there's this other type of foolishness that the Lord wants us to recognize. He describes it in the parable, in the folly that says, God doesn't matter and I can't get enough, right? The power of possessions is that they give us a feeling of control. So here's the thing we need to remember as disciples of Jesus. We face a folly that's similar to that. The folly that says, God doesn't care. Okay, it's easy. We are tempted to believe that if we follow the Lord, if we renounce all of our possessions, we may not have enough. Not to steal thunder from Kendall today, but to take a phrase. Did God really say? Fill in the blank, right? So here's the alternative, and that is a treasure that endures. And Jesus continues on speaking here in verses 22 through 34. Then Jesus said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. Life is more than food, and the body is more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the lilies grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you? O you of little faith, and do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it, for the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, where no thief comes and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. Now, I want to stop there for just a second. Did you catch in there? Because I just caught this. Okay? Remember, we started the passage by talking about the setting, and there were thousands of people. They were like trampling each other, right? And what does Jesus say? Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased. I thought that's very interesting. Obviously, he's speaking to his closest disciples there. Luke makes it very clear that this section is addressed not to the crowd, but to the disciples. And there's an implication here that worry is one of the sins that are setting into his followers, right? And the reason is not hard to discover. The terms of discipleship are demanding. Jesus said, come follow me, when he called them, right? There was no, hey, come follow me, and I'll make sure your wife and kids are taken care of. Hey, come follow me, and I'll make sure that you're taken care of, right? These guys had seen a lot. They'd already seen Jesus attacked. They'd already seen people try to stone him. They had already seen all of these things happening around them. And so this is going through their mind. The terms of discipleship are demanding. To obey the call is to trust Christ completely. But what are the implications? Well, first, financial questions loom large. If I say goodbye to all my possessions, will the Lord really meet my needs? My head assures me that he will, but my heart is not quite so certain. Proverbs 12:25 says, an anxious heart weighs a man down. Physically, this is so. As somebody has observed, people get ulcers not from what they eat as much as what eats them. Right? Anxiety also steals emotional peace, and it removes spiritual assurance. Right? Life was hard in biblical Palestine. It would be, life for those guys would be equivalent to peasant life in a third world country today. Think about that. Life that the disciples lived would be like living in a third world country as a peasant today. Okay? The needs of life didn't fall into their hands accidentally, nor were they delivered by a benevolent government. The old King James translation, which says, take no thought for your life, it seriously misrepresents the verb that the Lord uses. He's not calling for thoughtlessness or the absence of appropriate concern. The word that is used there is better illustrated by the complaint that Martha had to Jesus about her sister Mary's lack of assistance. Martha, we read, said, was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made in Luke 10:40. She was unable to enjoy the Lord's presence because her mind was divided by other responsibilities. And so the Greek word for worry means to divide the mind. So when we worry, we're splitting our mind, okay? The Latin root for the word anxiety is angere. It means to choke or to be in distress. So Jesus' words to her, to Martha, if we were to paraphrase them, Martha, Martha, you are divided and choked about many things. Makes a whole lot more sense than you are worried and upset about many things. Well, yeah, we've all been worried, we've all been upset. But suddenly you're divided. In other words, I can't focus on these. I don't multitask extremely well. I do it, but I don't do it well, okay? So I can relate to this 100%. I am, I got to finish this task, and then I can start the next one, okay?
I think that's a characteristic of a man overall.
You think so? I'm glad Jesus was different, because he could, he handled that. Anxiety is the emotional distraction and distress that comes from allowing the duties and the unknowns of life to absorb and control us. I can say there's been times where, we've had a big project or we've had something going on here at church, and you get focused on that, and it divides your attention suddenly from family, divides your attention from your job maybe, or vice versa, or from church. We've all been in those situations. You get anxious about that, and suddenly you're worrying about it. The key is to realize you can't change a thing. Worrying is not going to change a thing, right? Telling us not to worry is not helpful. Oh, honey, don't worry. I have a bad habit. Tell my wife, honey, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. Bad habit. That's not helpful, right? People who tell us that usually seem either unrealistic, uninformed, or patronizing, okay? The Lord forces us to think about why we are not to worry. First, he says that worry is foolish, in verses 22 through 24. It's falling into the folly of the rich fool who believed that his life consisted of possessions. But like you two, quit giggling back there. You can get me in trouble. But life is more than food and clothes, and God has promised us he'll care for us much more than he does for his creatures, which are the birds. To worry is to foolishly forget who we are. We are God's children, and who he is our loving Father. So we are not to worry. Okay, it's foolish. Second, worry is futile. In verses 25 through 28, he says, worry can shorten life, but it can't lengthen it. Think about that one for a minute. I can worry all I want, and it takes days away from me as opposed to adding to it. And God gives beauty to the fields, and the same God who gives beauty to the fields will not strip us bare. Anxiety denies the care of God, and all to no effect. So the alternative is to be careless and trustful, right? We go back to that 60s generation, the flower power, right? That's a little too far the other way. I can't quite make that. Dave can. He's got that going on back there. A little bit of reflection helps us to recognize that most worry, first of all, is about things that we can't change or that can't be changed, the past. Secondly, worry is about things that can't be controlled, which is in the present. Usually it's out of our hands. We're just waiting for something to develop. Or thirdly, things that might not happen, which is the future. Okay? I can't tell you how many times I have worried about something. Oh man, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? And it never happens. But I spent all that time worrying about it, right? How much better if we were to entrust ourselves to God? Third, that he says worry is faithless. In verses 29 through 31, he says to be absorbed with physical and personal needs is ultimately to be captured by unbelief. If the gospel is really true, then our lives should be different qualitatively from the lives of pagans. Pagans worry about those materialistic things. We should not worry about them. Okay? I love this phrase that he says, worry is the product of an inadequate understanding of our Father. You go, whoa, that's kind of, in your face. But worry, Worry is the product of an inadequate understanding of our Father. If we don't adequately understand who He is, we tend to worry, okay? He's God, our Father. He's the one who knows, He cares, He acts. The way that we look at God determines the way that we look at life, and this is determined what we worry about. Our great need is to worry about the right thing. Well, what is the right thing? Jesus said, seek His kingdom, right? We do not refrain from worrying. We replace concern about secondary things with concern about the primary things. Only His kingdom is worthy of our ultimate concern. There was I'll look at where my time is. Years ago, we took the youth group to a Dare to Share conference down in St. Louis. And these guys, I don't know if they're still doing it and still do the kind of job they did then, but the one that I remember going to, they did a skit for the kids. And this skit, they started off with an autistic boy who used to come to youth group. And he would just drive all the other kids nuts, right? And then so this youth pastor preached this sermon one day. He had this clock. It was tick, 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 tick. So you hear this loud as he's talking, saying that, do you realize that every 7 seconds someone dies without knowing Jesus? And for some reason, it clicked with this autistic boy. And he just decided that was his mission. He had to tell everybody about Jesus because I don't want any more people to die not knowing Jesus. So they go through this whole skit. The kids, and I don't, too many years between now and then, but all I recall is that towards the end of the skit, this boy is in a hospital bed dying. And the youth minister comes to see him, and all he wants to talk about is, don't forget, the clock is ticking. Every 7 seconds, somebody dies without knowing about Jesus. Every second. You hear that tick, tick through this whole thing. And it was just so impactful to realize, oh, this is what our mission is. It's to not only live it, but to tell it. Okay? And that's where you replace concern about secondary things. He wasn't worried about what had happened to him. He wasn't worried about what was going to happen to him. He was worried about what was going to happen to the people who don't know Jesus. Right? It was a great illustration, very, very impactful for the kids there. And that was a day where we went out into the streets in the city of St. Louis and just basically said, hey, can we pray for you? And do you know Jesus? Pure and simple. Now, yes.
Missionaries that what we call red countries,
Mm-hmm.
CEF. So we have missionaries that go into these countries, you know, and there's some of them that get stories back that they have taken their life.
Yeah.
Because they find out what they're doing underground or whatever.
Yeah. It's a sad, we don't hear enough about that in our country. Does go on in third world countries around. You wouldn't think that in our day and age. No, that doesn't happen. It happens all the time, and it happens a lot. Anxiety, believe it or not, has a twin. They're conjoined. They work together. Anxiety's twin is fear. And the Lord addresses that fear in verses 32 through 34. He calls us to take drastic action with our financial resources and our personal possessions. We are not to grasp them or to trust them. We are rather to dispose of them by investing them eternally. In fact, the only way we can truly protect our treasure is to invest it in heaven. Our hearts follow our treasure, and if our treasure is in heaven, so our hearts will be, right? The crucial issue in life is not the amount of our treasure, but it's the location of it. The rich man's treasures were here on earth. He was a fool because he built his life around what couldn't last or what really didn't matter. But the disciples' call from Jesus is to be rich toward God, and with the treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted. Now, D.L. Moody, who was a Christian scholar, once said, it does not take long to tell where a man's treasure is. Within a 15-minute conversation with most men, you can tell whether their treasures are on earth or in heaven. Have you ever met anybody like that? I got one that like popped in my head that I can remember. You could start a conversation, and within literally 2 to 3 minutes of that conversation, that individual would be telling you how big of a tractor he's got, or how great his farm is doing, or how well he did on this job, or how much he did there. It just didn't direct the conversation that way. We're talking about something completely different. All of a sudden, it's all about what I've done or what I've got or what, we all know those people, right? Okay? That's where you can tell. Now, that's not to be judgmental. It's just sometimes that comes out, okay? Sometimes, and I've met guys who are the opposite way, who have huge fortunes and do very, very well, and they would appear to be, they never talk about it, okay? Nobody wants to be called a fool by God, so how do we make sure that that doesn't happen? Well, here's the thing. We choose limits, not luxury, so that our treasure can be invested in heaven. We cultivate compassion, not greed. And most of all, we pursue confidence in God, not in money. I thought this was interesting. On our money, we Americans have the slogan printed, "In God we trust." Great words to remind us, right? But here's the question that this guy poses, and I was like, wow, that's kind of in your face. Do we trust God on our money or with our money? Do we trust God on our money or with our money? Writing of his slim financial resources in a time of escalating needs, a friend once said, if we find ourselves sinking, we will not cry out, "Uncle!" Instead, we're going to cry out, "Father," to the one who knows all of our needs and possessions and all of our resources. Such a person has learned the wisdom of God. Think about that. How many times you go to a funeral and it's not, they're not crying out "Uncle," they're crying out "Oh God," right? Such a person has learned the wisdom of God. And so we see through this parable of the rich fool, and then the passage that Jesus brings on after that, how important it can be not to become a rich fool, not to be a fool, period, right? Yes?
You said choose limits, not luxury, and then what was the next one?
So that our treasure can be invested in heaven. The other one after that was cultivate compassion, not greed. Compassion, not greed. Right? Limits, not luxury. Cultivate compassion, not greed. All right. Thoughts or comments on today's lesson? It's another one of those.
Yeah, I think to me, the whole wrap up in verse 21 becomes very important to the whole point that Jesus was getting at. The idea that if we store up things for ourselves, that life is more about just this life than being rich toward God. That's the whole point. We need to be rich toward God. That He is the most important thing.
Yes.
Always remember this couple. When I was at another church, there was this couple that started coming to church. They were a young couple, probably, I'd say in their late 20s. And they were really, seemed to me, they talked to me almost after church every Sunday. Really seemed to be enjoying, being there at church and learning and growing. And, it wasn't too long after they were there, maybe like 4 or 5 months, they said, well, we're like doing some remodeling, and I'm going to be doing this every weekend, so we won't be in church for probably the next 6 or 7 months. And they weren't. And I never saw them again.
It's easy, man. It is so easy when you fall out of the habit. It's so easy to say, oh, I'll just sleep in. Oh, I got something to do.
Well, just the whole point to me was that, I am no longer focused on being rich toward God. I'm focused on being rich toward this remodeling job that I got to be doing. And to me, that's how Satan works a lot of times in people's lives. He changes the course, the direction that they're headed on. And, somehow he's able to lead people to different conclusions. Like, this is the most important thing right now.
Yeah.
And through that, it ends up leading them away from God. And I don't know whatever happened to the couple. They could have started going to church somewhere else. But it was just interesting to me that, right now in this phase of my life, for the next 6 or 7 months, this is what I'm being rich toward, and this is the most important.
Yeah, exactly.
This is my bigger barn.
Yes, I guess the thing that I always think about for me is go ahead, Kim.
And you know what, and that's true, and I'm gonna tag on to what Kendall said, because for myself personally, I never let a job get in my way of church on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And I would never take a job that meant I had to work every other weekend, because it meant I had to work on Sundays. And you know, I did. And it took me down.
Mm-hmm.
I got out of church and I drifted. And it changed the entire directory of my spiritual walk and my spiritual life and my whole life.
Yeah.
Because I allowed a job, even a job I loved and was called to do, my passion and everything, I allowed it to be first
Before God.
before God and being in church on Sunday and serving and worshiping, to the point where, I wasn't even myself. And when I saw what was happening, and that was probably, if not the main cause, one of the main causes.
Yeah.
You know, I put a stop to it, and honestly, it was when we started coming here.
Well, praise the Lord for that.
It was like, I wanted to be here more than I wanted to be at work.
Right.
And that is, you know, and God used that to show me, hey, you've
Yeah.
been putting your work before me. And this is, you know, you need to be in my house and worshiping.
Yes.
And doing what you need to do for me first, and then I'll take care of it.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting that you can look at things like that? You can look at what you're pursuing in life. And I hear this phrase used all the time. This is as good as it gets. Right? This is as good as it gets. And I think to myself as a Christian, I think, man, if this is as good as it gets, I don't need this. Especially the older I get and the aches and the pains and the problems and the things going on. I don't need this. It's got to be better than this. It's got to be, right? And so, yeah. And so, go ahead.
Something that C.S. Lewis wrote about this world is the closest that some people will ever get to heaven, and this world is the closest that other people will ever get to hell. And that's a real sobering thought.
That is a very sobering thought.
The closest I ever get to heaven? Wow.
Yeah.
That is a
Yeah.
sobering thought, yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jim.
Just, I know it's getting late, but
That's
one
okay.
quick story.
Yeah.
A friend of mine who became my lifetime mentor, Becky's, him and a guy named Ben Blanton, Blanton Construction, started the ministry to men in St. Charles County, and it's grown to huge. And at one of their annual get-togethers, where there's usually about 750 to 1,000 people there. It was September the 11th,
Mm-hmm.
and Ron's job was to pick up the guest speaker. They always had a well-known guest speaker, and this year it was a fellow that built built and designed the Atlanta football stadium. He was a well-known Christian fellow. I can't remember his name, save me right now. But Ron picked him up at the airport, and he said, "Well, let's go out to dinner," because it was about dinner time. And the guy said, "No, I can't. God is changing my whole message for tomorrow, and I don't know why, but I've got to go to the motel room, and I've got to pray and find out why."
Mm-hmm.
Well, he gets on stage, and after the niceties and things like that, he starts to go, just what you said, tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock. Which one of us knows how much longer we have? And then a person runs in from the back and goes, "The World Trade Center has just been attacked and hit by hell."
Wow. That gave me goosebumps, Jim.
It just gave me,
Yeah.
every time
Yeah.
And so all these men got down on their knees and went into prayer.
That's awesome. That's awesome. But that's very true. How much time do we have left, and how many people? Like I said, every 7. That was years ago. Who knows what that number is now? So, okay. Next week we are talking about assuring my future, and it is it's the parable of the shrewd and the dishonest manager is who we're going to be talking about next week. So that should be another fun one.